The night was cold, the kind that sent shivers through even the thickest coats. Rain drizzled gently, coating the streets in a thin, shimmering layer of water. The city slept in silence, except for the occasional car passing by, its headlights slicing through the darkness. But on the front porch of an extravagant mansion, something was out of place. Something small, fragile, and alone. A baby, wrapped in a thin, worn-out blanket. The infant lay nestled in a basket, his tiny fingers curled into fists against the bitter night air. Beside him, pinned to the blanket, was a folded note. Faint moonlight illuminated the words, hastily scribbled in trembling handwriting. When Richard Montgomery, one of the wealthiest businessmen in the city, returned home that night, he never expected to find a child at his doorstep. He had spent the evening at a charity gala, shaking hands, making donations, playing the role of the perfect philanthropist. But as he stepped out of his sleek black car, something made him stop. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like a muffled whimper. Curious, Richard took a step closer, squinting in the dim light. His breath hitched the moment he saw it. A baby, here. For a moment, he just stood there, frozen in place. The sight was so out of place, so unreal, that his brain struggled to process it. Then, instinctively, he bent down and reached for the basket. The infant stirred, letting out a weak, pitiful cry that tugged at something deep inside Richard's chest. And then he saw the note. With trembling hands, he unfolded the damp paper, his sharp eyes scanning the hurried words. As he read, his heartbeat quickened. Please take care of my son. He has no one else. I can't give him the life he deserves, but you can. That was all. No name, no explanation, just a desperate plea. Richard's hands tightened around the paper. His mind raced with questions. Who would abandon their child like this? And why on his doorstep, of all places? He didn't know who this child was, where he came from, or why fate had chosen him, of all people, to find him. But as he looked down at the helpless baby, something inside him shifted. A part of him, long buried under years of wealth and business dealings, stirred awake. For years, Richard had lived a life of luxury. Grand mansions, expensive cars, power, influence. He had worked his way to the top, building an empire that stretched across the globe. Yet despite all his riches, he had never known the warmth of a family. His past was a guarded secret, a painful memory he refused to revisit. He had convinced himself that he didn't need love, that money and success were enough. But now, standing in the rain with a child abandoned at his feet, all of that seemed to blur into insignificance. He lifted the baby carefully, cradling the fragile body against his chest. The infant's warmth seeped through his suit, sending an unfamiliar sensation coursing through him. Protectiveness. Who had left him here? Why? Richard looked around, scanning the empty street, searching for any sign of the person who had left this child behind. But there was nothing. No shadows lurking in the darkness. No footsteps fading into the distance. Whoever had done this was long gone. Stepping into his mansion, Richard carried the baby inside, feeling the weight of the situation settle heavily upon him. The grand chandelier above cast a golden glow over the room, highlighting the contrast between his world of luxury and the tiny, abandoned child in his arms. He had no idea what to do next. Should he call the authorities, the child services? His mind told him yes, but his heart told him something else entirely. Something about this child felt different. Richard took a deep breath, looking down at the baby's tiny face. He was peaceful now, his cries fading into soft breaths. There was innocence in his features, a quiet trust that made Richard feel something he hadn't felt in years. He looked closer. Something caught his eye, something that made his breath hitch. A small pendant resting just beneath the folds of the blanket. It was old, worn, but unmistakable. Richard had seen this before. No, it couldn't be. His hand shook as he reached for the pendant, his pulse pounding in his ears. The moment he turned it over, a chill ran down his spine. There, etched into the metal, was a name Richard knew all too well, a name that changed everything. His vision blurred for a moment, as memories from a past he had long buried came rushing back. He staggered back, his grip tightening around the child, as if he were holding on to something much more than just a baby. This wasn't just some abandoned child. This baby was connected to him. How? Why? Richard's mind spiraled with questions, but deep down, he knew one thing for certain. This was no coincidence. Fate had brought this child to his doorstep for a reason, and whatever he was about to discover, it would change his life forever. Richard stood frozen in the middle of his lavish living room, his fingers tightening around the pendant, as if it held the answers to all the questions racing through his mind. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath unsteady. The name engraved on the small piece of metal was one he hadn't spoken in years, a name that belonged to a past he had spent his entire life running from. He slowly turned his gaze back to the baby, still nestled against his chest, sleeping soundly, completely unaware of the storm he had just unleashed inside Richard's mind. How was this possible? Who had left him here? And why was he wearing this pendant? Richard sank onto the leather couch, his hands trembling, as he carefully placed the baby in the crook of his arm. He needed answers, desperately, but the only person who could give them to him was nowhere to be found. His thoughts drifted back to his childhood, a past so painful he had spent years burying it under layers of success, wealth, and power. He had grown up in a broken home, abandoned by the very people who were supposed to love him. He had clawed his way out of poverty, building an empire from nothing. But despite all his achievements, he had never truly escaped the emptiness inside him. And now, fate had thrown this child into his life, forcing him to confront the past he had long tried to forget. His phone buzzed on the table, snapping him back to the present. He hesitated before picking it up, his fingers hovering over the screen. It was his assistant, Margaret, the only person in his life who truly knew him beyond his cold, calculated exterior. He answered the call, his voice unusually tense. "Margaret." "Sir, are you all right?" Her voice was laced with concern. "You left the gala early. Is something wrong?" Richard hesitated. How could he possibly explain what had just happened? I need you to come over," he said, finally. "It's important." There was a brief pause before Margaret responded. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Richard ended the call and leaned back against the couch, rubbing his temples. He needed to think. He needed to figure out what to do next. The baby stirred slightly in his arms, letting out a soft sigh. Richard glanced down at him, his expression unreadable. Despite the storm raging in his mind, there was something strangely calming about holding the child, a quiet, fragile presence that felt familiar. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Margaret was fast, as always. Richard carefully stood up, making sure not to wake the baby, and walked to the door. When he opened it, Margaret's eyes immediately widened at the sight before her. "Richard, what?" She stopped mid-sentence. When she noticed the child in his arms, she stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "What's going on?" Richard exhaled slowly, handing her the crumpled note and the pendant. Margaret's eyes scanned the note first, then moved to the pendant. As soon as she saw the name, her breath hitched. This can't be, she whispered, looking up at him. Richard, do you realize what this means? He nodded, his jaw clenched. That's why I called you. Margaret sank onto the couch, staring at the baby with a mixture of shock and disbelief. Where did he come from? He was left at my doorstep, Richard said, his voice tight. Lone, in the middle of the night, whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Margaret looked up at him, her expression troubled. Richard, if this child is connected to your past, then someone out there knows more than they should. Richard's hands curled into fists. He had spent years keeping his past buried. He had made sure that no one, not the media, not his business rivals, not even his closest associates, knew the full truth about where he came from. And yet, someone had found a way to reach him in the most personal, most unexpected way possible. His mind swirled with possibilities. Was this some kind of twisted message? A warning? Or was this truly just a desperate mother leaving her child with the only person she believed could help? Margaret's voice pulled him back. What are you going to do? Richard looked down at the baby, his heart warring with his mind. The logical side of him said he should contact the authorities, hand the child over to professionals who could find out where he belonged. But another part of him, the part he had long ignored, told him something different. This wasn't just some random child. This wasn't just some abandoned baby. This was personal. I need to find out who left him here, Richard said firmly. And why? Margaret studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then we start with the pendant. Richard exhaled. He knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, someone had left this baby at his doorstep for a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was about to change everything. Richard knew that uncovering the truth would mean opening doors he had sealed shut long ago. But there was no turning back now. The child in his arms wasn't just a mystery. He was a piece of Richard's past, one that had found its way back to him against all odds. Margaret wasted no time. With years of experience handling delicate matters for Richard, she knew exactly where to start. She took the pendant and made a few calls, using her network to trace its origins. Meanwhile, Richard tried to keep himself composed, but every second felt like a lifetime. The baby, unaware of the storm brewing around him, slept peacefully in Richard's arms. And despite everything, Richard couldn't help but feel connected, as if he was meant to find this child, as if fate had led him here for a reason. Hours later, Margaret returned with information that made Richard's blood run cold. The pendant, it belonged to her. Richard didn't need her to say the name. He already knew. His past had finally caught up to him. Years ago, before he had built his empire, before he had even known what success tasted like, there had been someone, a woman, the only person who had ever seen the real him, the broken boy behind the ambition. But life had pulled them apart. She had disappeared, leaving him with nothing but unanswered questions. And now, after all these years, the truth had landed right on his doorstep, wrapped in a blanket and wearing the one thing that could tie them together. Margaret's voice was cautious. Richard, she's gone. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He staggered back, gripping the couch for support. What? She passed away a few days ago. Margaret continued gently. She must have been desperate. She had no one else. That's why she brought him here. Richard felt the weight of those words settle deep inside him. She had come back. She had trusted him, even after all these years, to take care of her child, their child. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. This wasn't just any baby. This was his son. His knees nearly gave out. He had a son. A flesh and blood piece of him. One he never knew existed until this very moment. And now, the woman he had once loved was gone, leaving behind the only thing that mattered. Richard had spent his entire life believing that love was a weakness, that family was just another word for pain. He had locked himself away in a world of wealth and power, convinced that success was the only thing worth chasing. But as he looked down at the tiny boy in his arms, everything changed. He wasn't just a businessman. He wasn't just a man with a painful past. He was a father, and he wasn't going to fail this child the way life had failed him. Margaret watched him closely. "What do you want to do, Richard?" There was only one answer. "I'm keeping him." Margaret nodded, a small smile forming on her lips. "I thought you might say that." Richard Montgomery, the man who had built his empire on logic and calculation, had finally found something that truly mattered. Not money, not power, family. As he held his son close, he knew his life would never be the same, and for the first time in years, he was okay with that.